To give you a little bit of background, I'm the managing director of technology programs at DcODE. So that means I oversee our Accelerator programs, the investments that we make in the venture world, and I'll start with talking a little bit about what DcODE is and does, just so you have some context, and then I'll jump in. But please interrupt with questions. Now that I'm presenting, I won't actually see them, but luckily we've got Tori to jump in and interrupt me. Would love to answer any specifics that you have. If you do have questions, please share which company you're with, and obviously curious to hear any experience you have with the government, and then anything you're thinking about in terms of questions related to the presentation. So what does this mean for us? At a high level, right, the SBIR program is a great way to get a foot in the door in the government. And the AFWERX has done a really good job in terms of opening this pipeline of bringing tech in a different way. We have one company that went through our program who told us when they did the first round, I think last year, that it totally changed their perspective of their ability to work with government in a positive way for the first time in a long time. But there's a lot of work that you need to do as a company to actually capitalize on that success in a successful, scalable way, and make sure that doesn't take your business off track or pull you down the wrong direction. So that's a little bit about what we'll talk about. From the DcODE side, DcODE as an organization, our core mission is bringing better tech into the government faster. We do that in a bunch of different ways. We run accelerator programs that help growing tech companies into the government market. We work with the venture industry to help them understand where to drive their portfolios into government. We've got a government side of the house where we've trained a few hundred government how to actually get into the tech space and bring tech onto their projects more effectively. And then we do a whole bunch of work with industry partners. So whether that's big companies like Deloitte or Booz Allen or Amazon or Microsoft, down to smaller systems integrators that are really looking for better ways to bring tech into their government projects. So really what we are is we're a community of really passionate folks, all focused on bringing tech into the government more effectively. We've worked with over 100. I think we're passing 5 billion in venture funding for that portfolio right now. So they'll definitely go over the line with a strategic match, actually, which is exciting. And then we've seen a lot of success in terms of helping drive that scalable growth within government, which is really what we're looking for at the end of the one and done contract. Bring technology in more successfully there. So really, when we're talking about SBIR, again, you've gotten phase one, congratulations. Phase two is obviously a more substantial pot of money, but still just one grant award. And so really what we look at this as is, and I think the AFWERX team would say the same thing, is really just the first step in the beginning into a scalable process where you can start doing work across different parts of the Air Force, across different parts of government, whether that's DoD or civilian or the intelligence space. And while this provides a great platform to start doing that, you want to come in with a lot of context and a lot of thought on the front end onto how that fits into your larger go-to-market strategy. So we look at this in a couple different ways, and what I'll cover here is sort of high level, but again, please jump in with questions. Happy to talk about specific issues that you've run into and game out sort of how we would approach them. We live the pain every year with dozens of companies, and so we've seen everything under the sun come up, and always happy to give some additional perspective on how to think about problems that come up or strategic questions around you as a business. I'd say with the context that most of the tech that we work with, and this aligns pretty closely with the SBIR program, is really that dual use technology where really even in the longer term, the private sector is 80% or so of your revenue on average, and government is just part of that. But because government's the biggest enterprise in the world, they're a substantial customer, but not the biggest one. So lots of opportunity. Obviously, there is no larger buyer of technology in the world than the US government. But it's also complicated to work with, right? Even if you had someone write the SBIR proposal for you, you probably had to jump into wide area workflow at this point and live through right the challenges that are unique to government in a lot of different ways. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those unique considerations, especially from the perspective of how that impacts your business and your commercial business. And then in space, how do you actually scale for success? How do you track the demand signals that you see if you have some great conversations with folks across government over the next few weeks and months as you're doing your phase one discovery? What does that actually mean for you, and how about that from a revenue standpoint when managing a pipeline on the sales perspective in government is very different from how you might be tracking your sales pipeline in commercial. And then three, sort of taking that together, how do you engage in more effective customer discovery, and how do you leverage the reward jump? Right, for most of you, I'm sure this is already on your mind, probably on your boss's mind if you're the sales rep, right? Is an SBIR award at the end of the day is one-time revenue. It, will probably fall into the NRE bucket. And if you're looking to scale, if you're an enterprise software company in particular, right, you're really looking to get to ARR, get to recurring revenue that that actually is going to impact your valuation, especially on the venture side, where people look at government grants and say, well, that's not, doesn't impact the valuation of the company because this is a one-time award. And some of the key things that the Air Force has done that I really encourage everyone to take advantage of, and I'm sure people have already brought this up today, is the matching process and the incentives they have there. Right, so phase two comes out of the SBIR bucket of money one time. They can't pay for that same thing again. It's not coming from a customer. And so leveraging the foundation there to actually get to the budget, get to the problem owner, to somebody who will actually make the investment and be there for the longer term is going to be completely necessary, not just for your business, but also for your valuation as a company and making sure that you're looking at it the right way. Where I've seen this take companies off track is where they look at the dollar amount of an SBIR award and say, that's great, let's go after more of these and let's just try different use cases, and start to lose a little bit of focus rather than saying, let's use this as a foundation to expand what we already do and do very well across the government market in a more effective way. Second piece that's important here is the federal market is very risk averse, right? Nobody wants to be the first buyer of a technology most of the time. It's always less risky to go pay our friends at Lockheed or Booz Allen $1 billion more to build it from scratch because they're trusted, they're in the network, they know each other, versus buying a software license from somebody who's never worked with the government before. So you have a advantage on that, capitalize on the discussion in cities or it's already valid to some extent by the Air Force, and you're talking to folks there. The case, it's there for a reason, right? But it's an important barrier to overcome. And then lastly, super important, maintaining focus on your commercial business in an effective way can be difficult, again, especially at the early stages. If you're at the later stages, you're probably just trying to raise your hand and get some attention from your leadership on the federal side. But for the early stage, right, there are going to be engineering requests that come in, especially if you have to tweak your product for government. If all of a sudden you need to try to get your leadership to focus their resources towards security compliance because you need ATO at an agency, and that all of a sudden is a choice that you have to make strategically as a company between getting ATO'd for a government project or rolling out a new feature set that's going to be completely game changing for your commercial customers. There will be internal tensions that come from working with the government on a pretty consistent basis. And so it's important to think about some of the key factors that'll come up there, and how to navigate those internal politics and how to actually make those decisions on a strategic level when it comes to the fact that we all acknowledge that time is the most valuable resource that you have, especially as a growing tech company. So to talk a little bit about the sort of unique considerations that exist in government. Uh, One that we'll hear all the time is right, how do you actually navigate the stuff, right? Well, you know, you always hear from people say, oh, I talked to somebody at the Air Force, do you know them? And it's like, all right, no, we have how do you actually navigate the entire ecosystem that is the beast of federal government? Uh, so I'll talk a little bit in detail about how to do that and the stakeholders here. Uh, the unpredictable sales cycle I'll hit on now. It's one of the bigger risks for companies early on. It's one of the actual risks that the SBIR program has helped mitigate just by getting some cash in the door as validation, and doing so in a way that's relatively painless. But when you look at a sort of sales pipeline in commercial, you know, if you've got sales reps selling to the banking industry or retail or whatever it is, and they've got quarterly quotas and they're predicting them and they're hitting them on a sustainable basis, right? You're not going to be able to do that in the same way in the government market. I always like to joke that whatever percentage you have that you assign to a deal that you think it's going to close in the next quarter, subtract 80%. It's generally when we talk to earlier stage companies, especially or companies that are late stage but looking at the market for the first time, it's extremely hard to predict what's actually going to turn into a project or revenue within the first 2 years in the market. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, right? The money may get swept somewhere else. Even if you have someone who really wants to buy your technology, you may run into problems just with the integrator you're working with, or any whole host of issues on the contracting side. So it's just really hard to predict. There are some things that you can work around and focus on when it comes to the cycle of the federal fiscal year. But really, for the first 2 years, you have to be open-eyed about the fact that it's going to be unpredictable. And so normally we'll work with folks to say, here's what the addressable market is. Here's feasibly where you could get in year 2, 3, 4, 5. An ideal, oftentimes, and being comfortable with the fact that you may not see a lot of revenue those first 2 years if you're selling software in particular, and right, I'm often talking technology as a product, right? If you're selling services to government, that's a different world and not really the focus here. Fiscal year in particular, the government spends 75–80% of their money in the fourth quarter of the fiscal year, which ends September 30th. And that impacts not just hiring, but resourcing, when you do what type of sales and marketing, and when you'll kick off a lot of your contracts. And then the last piece that's extremely important is the prime contractors play a key role in any implementation of a more niche product, especially for getting to scale. Right, it may be that you pilot your technology in phase 2 directly with an Air Force customer to show them how it works and really start building it out. But if you're talking about getting to scale across 20 different agencies, a lot of times the end user may not actually be within the Air Force, even if they're the ones who benefit from it. So you may be integrating your software into a Leidos platform that working with prime contractors effectively is extremely important, both in the early days, but also as you get to scale, just in terms of the reach that they have across every single agency, and the difference in the level of work that they do in federal versus commercial. Right, you're much more likely to see the same job done by a Walmart employee in the CIO's office is actually done by a Lockheed Martin team at the VA. Right. And that's just the nature of how the government's structured. Is there are a lot more contractors doing the day-to-day work. So navigating the U.S. government. The one thing that I'll always hit on, especially for folks that are brand new to government, is don't think of the government as a customer. Think of it as an industry. Right, it's much more similar to working with the banking industry than it would be to working with Capital One. Right, you've got a number of federal agencies. That's how big the sprawl is. And even within each agency, right, you've got subcomponents, and then you've got different organizations that, you try to work with NASA. There's 10 different centers across NASA that all do very different things and operate independently, and you're gonna have to find the right ones and the right program below that. So it really is much more of an industry than it is a customer. And that's really important in terms of framing how you think about working with the government. And what that means for working with AFWERX and SBIR, right, is this is a great piece and a key piece in a much larger journey into the federal market. And you have to be thinking about it holistically if you want to set yourself up for success. Just looking at DoD in particular, right? Tons of different components, independent defense agencies, combatant commands, a lot of different places that will have varying degrees of budget, authority, different missions, right? The Defense Health Agency has a very different mission than the Defense Intelligence Agency, but they are both large organizations that could have a lot of relevance to any of your technologies. And so given just the breadth of the org chart at any agency, a couple things to keep in mind as you're starting to focus your journey. A key one is, what are the core use cases that you hear resonating? Sometimes they're going to be exact same use case that you're selling in the commercial market. A lot of times they may be a little bit different. A lot of times you may get a little bit pulled off track just by the breadth of what the government does, right? Going back to the example of comparing government to the banking industry, it really, in a lot of ways, mirrors every industry, right? You'll have agencies doing financial, agencies doing, OPM just does HR. There's a really broad range of use cases that you can explore across the government. And really what you want to focus in on, especially as you're doing this custom, is trying to be really thoughtful about which 3 to 5 use cases are really both resonating, but also seem to have a clearer path to actually getting some work done. What that often means is there a clear customer base that is not sort of a distributed set of stakeholders, right? Is there somebody who can both buy it and use it in a simple, easy way? So even if you could solve 1,000 problems across government, which are the 3 that are going to be the easiest for you to do so? And then you can look sort of more holistically and say, okay, well, I'm gonna try to reach these 5 people at these 5 Air Force programs. Same thing across Navy, Army, or whatever it may be. So really focusing in on core use cases, mapping that to what exists within government, and then being pretty targeted in how you spend your time, because it's very easy to spend all your time in government. And again, if you're especially an early stage company, that's going to put your entire business at risk. So you want to be very focused and thoughtful about how you go about that. One of the ways to think about, again, going back to the multi-stakeholder process within government, is, and this is very similar to what you would do in the commercial world when it comes to qualifying a buyer and thinking about what they need to have in order to be somebody who could buy your product. It just looks a little different in government, right? So generally, for somebody to actually buy your software, and this is beyond SBIR, right? They're going to need to have the requirements, which is the government jingo word for actually having the need to buy your product, right? Term requirements is used sort of consistently in government as what they need, right? They'll post their requirements in their RFI or RFP. So they need to have the requirements, they need to have the authority, so the actual ability to make the decision to buy, and they need to have the budget. And the trickier part about government is it's much less common for one person to have all 3 of these things. And so often you're trying to find somebody who has 2 who can get you to the 3rd. The nice thing about the SBIR program that makes your life much easier here is that the initial budget already exists. It's already been identified. It's the SBIR program, right? So AFWERX will take care of that budget piece, which allows you to just focus on finding the person who actually has some relevant requirements and has the authority to say, yes, I'd like to do a pilot and sign an MOU to do a phase 2. So it's, even if that's not, even if you don't get matching in phase 2, you're really going to want to make sure that you're talking to your potential customer about where they're going to either find some fallout funds at the end of the year, something to start making this a sustainable a sustainable project that really scales beyond the pilot. Just to give you some examples of personas here, right? You might have, like, let's say you have a great opportunity to sit down one-on-one with a two-star general who oversees some relevant programs. They have some authority in the organization, but they're actually not going to be the ones who day-to-day make budgetary decisions or have the specific requirements that somebody down at the program level in their PEO might. And so you're really, if you're sitting down with someone who has at that authority level, you're going to be looking to see, do they have someone in their org with the requirements and with the budgets that they can introduce you to actually have a more meaningful conversation. Somebody who has all three will often be, especially within DoD, right? Somebody who's at a PEO managing a program and sort of has responsibility for executing a specific budget that aligns with what you do. But very important to keep these in mind. There are a lot of people, right? The government's a big place. So there are a lot of people who are very passionate about technology and who are excited to talk to you about your product, but they don't know sales. They don't necessarily know their internal procurement processes. And so in order to stay focused, it's important to have some of this in mind in terms of actually getting to integrate with a program. On the other side of this, once you actually are starting to do work, it's really important to think about the state. Again, you're going to be having a slightly easier time of it this time around because you've already got a contracting officer, the person who's managing your SBIR, and they're going to be the ones guiding you through phase 2 as well. But there are other stakeholders to keep in mind here, right? So normally during an engagement with government where you're selling your product and you're starting to work with someone, right? The program manager is the person who's actually seeing the implementation, knows what you do, wants it on their team, and is pushing for that process. But they're not the ones who sign the check. That's the contracting officer. They're not the ones who give you authority. The budget. And so there are a lot of people who are stakeholders in the procurement process and who are all empowered and authorized to say no. And it's going to be really important for you to think about how that plays into both your go-to-market and your product specifically, but also how you engage from a sales perspective. Key to this, and the AFWERX folks will hit on this, and I think it is mentioned even in the application process as you get started with phase 1. You want to be thinking about what it'll take to build towards an authority to operate or compliance. If you need to deploy your software in a government network, you're going to need to find somebody who's willing to help Sherpa that process along and make sure that you actually get approved on the network. Similarly, on the contracting side, again, for the SBIR itself, great. Once you get out into other agencies, understanding how to speak contracting enough to guide your product through the process is going to be extremely important. You'll hear a lot about phase 3 as a contracting option that's on the table. A lot of contracting officers across the breadth of the government have never used it and won't necessarily be comfortable with that. And so you will absolutely have a lot of different ways in which you'll need to guide the process, whether it's being billed up as another direct cost from a prime contractor or sort of using a larger GWAC contract vehicle like NASA SOUP or GSA Schedule 70. So there are a lot of ways that you'll have to think about setting a foundation for growth beyond phase 1 that are relatively complex and critical to actually seeing success. And this is where we see that government sales cycle taking 2 years or 3 years or whatever. It's because if you don't jump in deliberately with some knowledge on that process, all of a sudden contracting goes sideways and it takes 6 months longer than you expected. And then the ATO process isn't what you thought it would be, and it takes another 12 months. And so these are the things where you really need a little bit of expertise or advice, or at least thoughtfulness about how you're approaching it in order to set yourself up for success in the near to medium term. All right. Here they've got the 3 cycles, they've got the budget allocated, and that's sort of up to the SBIR program to spend. But once you get outside of SBIR, it's a whole different world. Generally, right, the actual budget process in terms of an agency getting additional budget from Congress to do something new is a multi-year process. So that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about getting to budget. And if somebody says, "Well, I can't work with you because I'd have to get new budget from Congress," what you want to do is push them towards how can you fit into the existing budget, because you're really unless you've got something crazy new and important, you're not getting a line item in the congressional budget specifically to buy your technology. So instead, you're really looking at how do you identify uh, either existing budgets and programs or big prime contractor projects that you could slot into, or you're really looking at the end of the fiscal year and what often in the Air Force is called fallout funds. But essentially, what this is uh, everyone wants to spend all their money by the end of the fiscal year because otherwise they're going to lose it. And so there's a very strong incentive, super counterintuitive to the commercial world. You want to spend all of your money, every single dollar. And so uh, people essentially, and we're sort of in that time of year right now, right? March, April, May, they're starting to put up requests. They're starting to look at where we have extra budget, what do we spend it on? And then that money all starts going out the door, going on contract, sort of in the summer leading up to September. And so there's a full cycle to a pretty significant percentage of DoD spending going out through that process, that really will define a lot of, especially as a new company, how you're able to get budget. So to talk a little bit about scaling for success from a team perspective, I think one of the things that's critically important is to just not overhire. It's something that we see a lot with companies that that have trouble is seeing one big contract and saying, "Great, uh, we had one person slightly focused on this, and they closed $1 million contract. So let's hire 10 people, and then we'll make $10 million, right?" And that's generally a recipe for disaster. Normally, those companies will have fired their team the next year. It's not good for your culture. It's not good for your relationship with the government. It's not good for sort of setting yourself up at that scale. Uh, so overhiring is common because you'll get that big contract demand signal, and then all of a sudden it's a little bit more complicated than that to actually get to scale from one big award. So knowing the pipeline that you have and how realistic it is for things to close, so you can do it in a sustainable way is very important. One thing that you'll get asked about a lot is providing services to the government. Right. So where again, if you're selling to Walmart and let's say you're a security tool and Walmart wants to use the tool in their SOC, their security operations center, right? They might just buy a license and call it a day. In government, they may say, "Great, but we don't, we're going to need at least 2 people from your team on site to manage this," and so there's generally a higher need for services and a higher expectation. And so you'll want to balance where you say yes to that versus where you say, okay, the demand signal is high. Let's go to somebody who's in the market as a services firm and can provide some of those services around the product and become a partner in a more scalable way. Uh, it's just a very different services ecosystem here where companies will staff up, staff down, hire 50 people for a new project in 2 days, and then have to let them all go at the end of that contract, and they'll all roll into the next contractor's company. And so it's a little bit of a different mindset that you want to make sure you recognize and don't get pulled into where it detracts from how you're traditionally structured as a business in the commercial world. Uh, in terms of resourcing your team smartly, again, focus is critical here. Maintaining focus on your core use cases. Really, what's going to get you starting to ramp up within government is a couple different things. One, it is very relationship driven, so it's having those relationships that take time to build. But two, it often ends up being brand awareness and past performance, right? Once you've actually got a couple referenceable stories that you can tell within government specifically, regardless of what you've done in the commercial world, to say, yes, we worked with the F-35 PO to do X, Y, and Z, and here's what we accomplished. That's going to make it much easier for you to start scaling up and doing it other places. Is king in government. The other piece is leveraging partners heavily. And I'll talk a little bit about how to do that in the auspices of the SBIR program. But fiscal agents, contract operators, even PEOs or at the base level, that can end up being really valuable partners because they really know the customer. They're incentivized to make sure that their Air Force customer is seeing value from them, and where there's ways to partner with them, that can be a really mutually beneficial relationship that allows you to take advantage of the resources and expertise that they have on the customer side. In terms of planning around the fiscal year cycle, again, with the fourth quarter ending September 30th, really what a lot of folks do is you're starting, beginning of the year, the calendar year, January or so is outreach, marketing, etc. Where ideally by the time you hit March, April, May, you've really had a lot of substantive conversations about folks who are very interested in your technology and starting to make requests about budget around that, because those decisions are going to be made May, July. And so if you miss that window, especially in this, when it comes to thinking about your pipeline, thinking about hiring, right? If you hire somebody to head up your federal work or to do federal business development, if you hire that person in May, you're going to want to be realistic about the fact that they're probably not going to be bringing home any bacon until the next calendar year, right? Just because the likelihood of closing things outside of that cycle is just significantly lower. There certainly is a lot of spending that happens, but again, the bulk of it, 75, 80%, happens in that fourth quarter. The long sales cycle, really important here on the other side of the house, right? Thinking about your runway, especially if you're a venture-backed company, but even if you're bootstrapped, right? Government revenue goes up and down. There's so many different factors that can lead to something you thought was going to happen. A big $1 million contract that was supposed to hit in January doesn't hit until was going to happen. There's just many more reasons that can happen in the government world, and so you want to be ready to withstand the risks. That generally means making sure that you have a healthy, dedicated commercial practice that you maintain focus on, and just be aware of what may come in the government space. Again, for enterprise software companies, you're usually saying, all right, be ready for 2 years without revenue. That's generally not the case these days, as long as you've got a good team and a good focus, and the timing is right. But you can absolutely go 2 years without seeing a dollar in the door, and that's sort of the traditional approach. Again, a lot of the work that AFWERX has done and a lot of these innovation hubs have done have made that process easier by having easier paths to get revenue more quickly. But that's certainly still the traditional mindset and a realistic one that you want to be aware of. And just to give an example here from a company that we know that didn't come through our program, but one that is a larger scale, right? So this is a company that year zero in the government market, they'd already raised over $100 million. They had over $10 million a year in commercial sales. And they said, all right, it's time for us to go look at government. So what do? They hired a couple sales leaders, one on the actual sales and engagement side, and one sort of more as a thought leader, business development person. And for 2 years saw essentially zero revenue, right? Big investments in partnerships, marketing, et cetera. And this is really any big company. They went public somewhere within the 6-year span, right? So they're working with the biggest enterprises in the world, but they're really looking at government saying, we're not going to see any money for the first 2 years, and that's just how it is. Years 3 to 5, starting to hire account reps if you're thinking about staffing up normally. Right, if you're splitting the government out into accounts, you may do DoD and civilian, and then hire a federal systems integrators person, or have a SE in terms of how you staff that out. But generally, you're seeing that sort of very slow curve from $0 up to 6 figures in year 3, 7 figures year 4, and then finally getting up to year 6, all of a sudden they're at 7 million and they're actually becoming a real portion of that company's overall business. But so it's a very long cycle traditionally. And I'm showing you this as sort of the context of historically, this is what people expect. Things are moving faster now in a lot of places in a lot of ways. Thanks to all the work that Dr. Roper and the AFWERX folks have put on the Air Force side, we're certainly seeing faster traction. But you have to be ready for the fact that this may still be what you're right there. And again, there are one-off wins, and what you want to do is you want to get to that year 6 in year 3, as opposed to just having one contract and then still get back into that longer cycle to get to scale. So in order to bring it all back to sort of why we're here, what can you do based on all this to actually leverage and take full advantage of your SBIR award to jumpstart your growth? There are a couple things that I would say I really recommend that you focus on. Number one is matching funds, right? So AFWERX funds are put in from your customer. On the customer, to do that is pretty high, right? They're going to see more bang for their buck on that side. But much more important to that, and the reason that AFWERX does this, and the reason that it's so valuable for everyone involved is, right, if they're finding funds, that means that they have actually identified a source of funds that they could theoretically identify for year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, versus phase 2 money that's going to be gone and that's one and done. And so really focusing on having that matching funds conversation early and trying to find somebody who can bring that to the table means that you're setting yourself up for scale, for success, and for a sustainable project. Number 2, and one that often doesn't come up in this process, but I think we're pushing to try to get more people to do, because I think there's value to be had there, is looking more intentionally at the partner ecosystem. What I mean by that is the prime contractors and systems integrators who are already deeply embedded in the space. So whether that's sort of one of the big primes, right? The Deloitte, Booz Allen, Accenture, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, whatever, or smaller ones at any agency. Especially if you don't have a lot of resources in the government market, it's going to take you a lot of work, a lot of time to get right, even the paperwork done on this stuff. So engaging with them, right, when you're talking to a customer, asking them if they have a good prime that they're already working with. Some of the incentives that and levers that you can pull here is, right, they could come on as a sub to your phase 2 and do a little bit of the work. They're going to be incentivized to do that, not as much from the one-off dollar value necessarily, but from building a partnership with you where there's an opportunity for phase 3 contracting for both of you. And so building those relationships with the industry partners who are within government as service providers or systems integrators or channel partners are going to be critically important to helping build good relationships with folks that you'll need in order to be able to scale across different agencies and programs. 10 times out of 10, leverage that Air Force logo, use that validation, right? You have a public award from the US Air Force, and they have vetted your technology through round 1 here, and that's something that provides a lot of comfort and value to other government folks that you talk to, even if they're at, even if you're talking to somebody at the census or the FCC or in the intelligence community. Again, having that sort of validator to say, yes, I'm already working with the Air Force, we're talking to these people, helps people get a higher comfort level that you're here to stay and you know what you're talking about in a way that's critically important in this risk-averse market. And then holistically, again, bringing it all back, plan for sustainable scale. Nobody intends for this to be a one-off research project, right? The reason that this AFWERX dual use program exists is to actually bring you in and keep you here to stay. But that takes planning and that takes work, right? And so 100% recommend thinking about what that looks like for you, identifying how to take these core use cases that you're starting to see traction on and really bringing them to the rest of government as well. And that involves thinking about contracting vehicles and all sorts of stuff. So that's That's all that I've got for you all here. Again, I'm very happy to jump in and answer questions that folks have, even if it's specifically about your business and what you're thinking about. In terms of how to contact us, my email's up here. You can reach our accelerator team and our tech scouting team. Uh, Happy to chat more with folks about our accelerator program or anything else related to how to solve these problems. We all of us at DeCODE care deeply about helping make sure this is a success for everyone.
If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A section. We'll be monitoring them.
Looks like we got one here on using the Air Force logo. So Navroop Mitter's question is, what are the rules on using the Air Force logo with a Phase 1 award in commercial and government environments? So there's a little bit of sensitivity more broadly to using government logos publicly, generally speaking. So if you have a one-off contract, especially let's say with an intelligence agency, but even if it's with like CBP or something, they're going to be a little bit concerned the public affairs shop off on these things. A lot of times if people are doing good work, they don't want their boss to know or their boss's boss, because all of a sudden they're going to start getting a spotlight on them when they just want to do good work with you. So there's absolutely sensitivity to when you can use a logo specifically, and if there's somebody from the SBIR team who disagrees, let me know. But specifically for this one, these awards are public, right? It's all published out to FPDS, but will also be up on the AFWERX website. You are publicly a Phase 1 award winner. So for SBIR awards, those are all publicized. There shouldn't be restrictions on you referencing that in any either in a press release or in a sort of pitch deck for government or commercial.
We got a question from Guy Kelly. They asked, we sell to local governments as well as federal. Does your accelerator help with local government contracting or just federal?
So we're focused on federal. State and local is a unique world. Every state, municipality, county does, in a lot of cases, contracting a little bit differently. So we do it on an ad hoc basis for companies that are in our accelerator. And we've had some companies come through that are pretty broadly spread across state and local. So happy to have detailed conversations with folks where they have questions. It's not today a focus of ours. Federal government keeps us busy.
So we do have another one from Jerry Curry. For newly awarded SBIR Phase 1 open topic, where do we find the preliminary report and final report template?
So that'll be a question for the Air Force folks in terms of where the templates are. I know they've got that Dropbox, and I'm not sure if they're updating that or sending it out, but I'd reach out to your Air Force point of contact or your contracting officer. It looks like there might be a couple on if we have a Naval X contract, do we stay in the Navy lane? So if it was part of the joint one, you can market that to anybody who's part of the joint topic for Phase 2. Right, so the joint one, while run out of AFWERX, was also participated in by Naval X in the Navy, by SOCOM, by Army, and I believe by OSD via DIU. And so for those, you absolutely can pursue Phase 2 with any of the joint partners, and I would recommend doing that. I think it'll be an interesting dynamic. We'll see how it plays out. But right within the Air Force, because they've done it a number of times, you've got a lot of folks who are starting to know how the process works, and so it may be easier to find folks who know it works. But it's also going to be more crowded because you've had hundreds of companies win. So if you're looking at Navy or then we've got a question on finding email addresses. So if you find, if you find someone's name and you're trying to reach them, certainly like they're all Air Force emails are structured in the same way. So normally what I would do is just type it out and Google that email address and see if it pops up and if you can validate that you've guessed the right one. Otherwise, certainly reaching out to folks in the network and asking if they know them. It tends to be a smaller world than you'd expect given how big the Air Force is. But I mean, within our community, right, we can raise a flare and say, hey, does someone know this person at this agency? And there's almost always someone that does. I'd also recommend for those that aren't involved in the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, they've got a great Slack channel of folks across DoD who are always proactive in helping folks out.
Another question from Sky Kelly. They asked, what stage of companies does your accelerator accept, and are there any specific revenue requirements?
So we're stage agnostic. So intentionally, we're looking for companies at sort of all stages based on the potential of impact that they have on later stage. So the average raise for a company coming through DeCODE is $40 or $50 million in venture funding, which speaks to the fact that they've already got commercial traction and revenue and a long enough runway to deal with the pain of the government market. So that's generally where we're focused, all the way up to public companies in some cases. But we do work with a small number of early stage companies where we have a lot of faith in the team, see a potential impact for the technology in a really disruptive way. So for each cohort, we'll usually accept about 7 companies. And then we're looking at, maybe a couple have raised 100 million or more. The bulk of them have raised a Series A or beyond, and then 1 or 2 that are seed stage. But we're always happy to talk to folks. I mean, I would say, right, we generally have an application period going on, so we're closing our applications tomorrow for our next cybersecurity focus program. But again, we've got a tech scouting team. We've got a team focused on helping government find the right technology. And so we're always excited to learn about what you have going on. And even if it's not a fit for what we're doing, we're happy to send folks in the right direction, whether that's to an early stage accelerator or some of the VCs in our network that might be interested in investing, that kind of thing. So I'm seeing a bunch of questions in here. Try to get to as many as possible on time here. Otherwise, you've got my email here and feel free to shoot me a note and I'll get to you if I miss it. So one question on COVID-19 and how to do discovery while working remote. It's certainly becoming challenging. We had like dozen different government meetings across our team just today that all had to switch to virtual. So we're getting a lot of guidance on internally within agencies to said people are happy to take phone calls. It's going to be more challenging for sure, but especially if people end up working from home, you may be able to get them on their personal phone on a Zoom line or something. So will it be more challenging? Yes. Are the people who you want to be working with for this are going to be the forward-leaning ones who are excited about bringing new tech in, and we find they're normally excited to find a way to make it work. So there will be a lot of government folks working remote as well, and we expect that to be challenging, but still doable. And then a question from Michael Fraser here on phase 2. With the Air Force and a direct to phase 2 with the Navy at the same time. Again, no legal advice here, and I'm not a contracting officer, but the general non-technical guidance, right? You cannot receive an SBIR award twice for doing the same work. So if you're doing substantively and substantially different work on a different project, you can theoretically be doing two phase twos at the same time. If they're both within the scope of the same program, so within this dual use one, that I do not believe that that's possible. I'd have to confirm that with other folks, but I know at least for phase one, you can only do one at a time. So that's the guidance that I have heard, but again, this is not coming from the horse's mouth here. And then a question on the matching for investor valuations. Is it reasonable to add the match to the funds? And then we've got another question on speaking more about the matching funds. So this will all be detailed for the resources that you got from AFWERX. And I know they changed it a little bit this round, so I'm haven't read through the new version myself. But essentially, the way it worked before, right? If the customer, so let's say, yes, we want to do this, and to support 2-1, so $1 million on top. So you get 1.5 million, which is great for the folks at ATC, because then they're saying, great, all right, we're actually getting basically 3x bang for our buck in terms of this investment, while also making sure that they're sourcing those funds shows that they have skin in the game and aren't just poking around with your tech and then gonna walk away later. What I would recommend for that is we actually have not the next session, but the session after that for DeCODE is one of our alumni companies who got matching funds from 2 different bases, talking through how they actually went through that process. So definitely recommend sitting in on that one. What I heard for this round is that the matching funds are a little bit less financially attractive this time around than last time around, but I just don't have those details on hand.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nate. I'm sure this is a lot of information everyone appreciated. Just for sake of time, I think we're going to cap it off at those questions there. But if you have any other questions, like Nate said, reach out to him via email. And then we're going to get ready for our next session, which is going to be Build Your BS Detector, How to Source the Best Companies, again with DeCODE. If we could give everyone, if Nate, like virtual applause. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of the webinars.